Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to the African American Studies channel at the New Books Network. My name is Brittany Edmonds, and I'm very happy to welcome our guest for today, Dr. Olúfẹ Táíwò. He's here today to talk about his forthcoming book, Elite Capture: How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics and Everything Else. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to start just with I think, a very easy question, which is, what is elite capture?
So the basic thing that elite capture is when a group or society's interests get whittled down to what they have, what the whole group has in common with those at the top. So it might be resources or a political agenda, but those things end up being hyper responsive, more responsive to the most advantaged members of the group or society. So I think that much is clear from the words elite capture. The thing that I would add to it that is maybe a little bit more interesting is that I think elite capture is a system behavior, right? So it's not a conspiracy. It's not that, we have to imagine in every society or every era of history that the people with the lion's share of land or wealth are getting together in a room and deciding to organize all of social life around what they find important. But it's just a thing that happens when you have inequality and you have institutions that fail to constrain the social effects of inequality.
So that's so interesting. And I think that that's definitely going to bleed into some questions I have later. But so already you're saying that there are certain kinds of conditions in which something like elite capture sort of thrives more readily than other kinds of conditions. Okay, wow. So you started this work, and I first came to know of your work through an article you wrote, and I'm just curious about what drove you to expand it into a book, and maybe what this book might have to tell us that the article did not.
So there are actually a couple articles. There was one at the Boston Review that was working with E. Franklin Fraser's work on the Black bourgeoisie. And then there was another article that came out later in The Philosopher that was talking about standpoint epistemology and, the politics of knowledge, essentially. And I was surprised at the reaction to both of the articles. I think it's just one of those time periods where those are issues that people are thinking about and wanting to talk about. And so naturally, an essay comes out that's trying to delve into that topic, and people, have a lot to say. They agree, they disagree, they have more questions, all those kinds of responses. But it just got way more engagement than I think I was anticipating before writing either of them. And so after the second one came out, I thought, I thought it would potentially be useful to expand both of those. So both of the chapters, both of those essays are woven into the chapters of the book. But what the book adds is a fair bit of historical context, both of the theorists who I learned from in putting together the kind of core ideas of the book, and also of the political struggles that, to me, best embody the kind of alternative to deference politics, which is the version of identity politics that I am critical of. The alternative to that is what I call constructive politics, which I think was powerfully practiced in the national liberation struggles of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, and is powerfully part of workers' struggles and, other kinds of political movements that have happened and that we can learn from historically, but maybe just as importantly are happening right now and that we can simply join and support.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, just sitting with a bit of you wrote these two articles and you weren't anticipating such a sort of big reaction to them. One of the things that's so interesting about that is that, it seems like you have your finger on the pulse of something, and it's so curious that you didn't sort of write it with that intent. Like, I'm noticing this thing, someone should write about it, I'll be the person that writes about it. And so I guess I'm curious if there was a set of sort of instigating conversations or an event, or if maybe you were sort of deferred to in a particular room. I'm just curious about sort of what led you, if not sort of feeling like you were witnessing something that was pervasive enough to put your finger on, but instead you were just like, no, I'm noticing this, I'm going to write an article about it. I'm curious, what was the sort of instigating event that led to this wonderful book, to those two articles?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that there was a singular event, but I there were a number of experiences that I had organizing in LA, which is where I did my graduate work, that made me think both that my initial conviction that identity politics was an important approach and that it had lessons for us and that we should keep it around. You know, I both was kind of cemented in my conviction that that was the case, that we need identity politics, that it's good, and also that the particular ways that we're thinking about identity politics and the particular norms that we have around kind of living it out in our everyday practices really merit some criticism, really need some work. And I was having both of those thoughts at the same time and trying to reconcile those thoughts together in an environment where a lot of the people who are critical of identity politics are critical of the whole enterprise, right? So a lot of people weren't necessarily distinguishing between particular ways identity politics was thought about and the project of identity politics. And so yeah, it was a kind of very intellectual problem for me, and I thought it might be of interest to a few organizers, a few other academic egghead types. And all of a sudden there's this whole different kind of response. And I think maybe what I wasn't clocking at the time, what I didn't quite latch onto, was both how tied up with broader politics and broader cultural war politics that those things I was seeing in the organizing world were, and also how interested people were in thinking about those norms. It's not just that people have opinions about whatever critical race theory or et cetera, but people actually people want to think about it. People want to get under the hood and see what's going on in those debates. And once the second essay came out, I thought, maybe there's more here than I initially thought.
Yeah, there's a number of things that, keep going off in my mind, and I'm trying to stay to my script, but then I'm like, no, I'm interested in this. And so I want to stay here with you sort of characterizing the book as growing out of a intellectual problem, and one that you at first thought would be interesting only to eggheads and organizers, because those seem to me to be, in my mind, kind of worlds apart. And so, and I will qualify that if I need to. But what I'm interested in is that you describe your sort of interest in this set of ideas, you needing to sort of critique identity politics, but at the same time thinking there's some good stuff there. And so needing to reconcile what was not good with what was good, what needed to be sort of preserved. I'm curious that grew out of organizing, right? So actually sort of boots on the ground work. And I'm just interested in maybe hearing you talk a bit about, one of the things that's so interesting about your book is its sweep across so many different sort of social arenas. And so maybe I'm interested in this sort of link between, an institution, maybe like what it means to be an academic now, but also this organizing work. And you haven't been in grad school, right? So studying within an institution, but nevertheless engaged in this activist work. And I don't know if it's participation in both of those spheres that made you sort of able to articulate this in a way that resounds. But I wonder if you could talk about this, because I mean, as you can imagine, I do want to return back to that earlier statement you made about elite capture being a system behavior, right? And it having certain conditions where it thrives. And so all of that is kind of circulating in my mind as you describe the sort of origins of this project.
Yeah, I definitely think being in those two different kinds of spaces has a lot to do with the way that this thought ended up coming out for me, right? Where being in academia, being in grad school gave me the opportunity to take the kinds of history classes and do the kind of reading that would let me kind of sit the experiences I was having in the organizing world against these very different settings, right? Against the settings that Fraser was interested in decades earlier, the settings that Fanon was interested in decades earlier. Um, and that's the kind of starting point for at least the intellectual academic version of the problem, right? How do I, what are the resonances? What are the bits of overlap between those very different contexts and the context I find myself in? But also, I think the organizing work contributes to the impulse towards the practical that I try to basically just say in theoretical terms, right? What's constructive politics? Well, it's kind of activity. It's where, we're building things, building institutions. Theory can help us do that. Lots of things can help us do that, but it's actually doing the construction work that would build a union or a movement for this or a movement for that. And it's it's definitely the organizing world where the bias towards action comes from. And yeah, I think I do my best in the book to try to reconcile those with each other.
Yeah, I love that, the impulse toward the practical. I had a question about. I think that that's related to that, and we're going to be digging into your chapters in just a bit. But as you were speaking and you sort of name checked Fraser again, I was thinking about the sort of different theorists, scholars, activists you draw on, and it seems to me that not all of them would identify themselves sort of as politically, of a kind. And so I'm curious about what you make of that. I'm curious about whether or not you think that tells us something about politics and its definitions, if or what to make of it. That sort of Fraser is in a cohort in your book with someone like Fanon, right? You can say them in the same breath, and that somehow makes sense. And so, yeah, I'm curious about. I don't know if you could say something about that.
Yeah, I have a. I'm so glad that you asked me about that. Because I feel like I end up talking around this with a lot of people. And it's one of those issues where I have this rant built up inside of me about this issue. But no, I think that's totally right. Fraser, Woodson, probably left of center for their time, but not in the sense that Fanon, was left of center, right? Like Cabral is essentially, he's speaking in, very deep terminology that Marxists would recognize. And, Lilika Boao is part of that whole trajectory as well. Ndaye and Walter Rodney are contemporaries. It's all these various different movements that are not only geographically distinct, but like, as you said, very ideologically different. And I don't know. I think that is interesting, but one of the things I get ranty about is that, these are questions that are often asked of works that use kind of Black authors and Black thinkers and, Black intellectual work that aren't always when other people are involved, right? Everybody I mentioned is to the left of Hegel, right? Right. And and I know that, that's to reference that kind of person would have a certain kind of currency in a lot of circles where there'd be these additional questions if you bring in E. Franklin Frazier, et cetera, et cetera. But it's just taken for granted for some people that they're doing the kind of intellectual work that is universally enlightening, that, people across the different political spectrum could make use of. And so I'm appreciative of that question, because then I get to say a thing that I just kind of left implicit in the book, which is that is just true of Carter G. Woodson. It's true of E. Franklin Frazier, right? I'm not invoking them as, members of an identity group who, were barking up the same ideological tree that I'm barking up, right? I'm invoking them as people who made philosophical discoveries in precisely the same sense that I'm invoking, David Lewis, the analytic philosopher who I talk about, or Robert Stallnacher, not people who are whatever, avowed Marxist-Leninists or whatever, but but people who made philosophical insights that are useful and helpful. And that's, that's a status we can afford more widely than we do. And I think, lots of the people that I cite in the book are deserving of it.
Yeah, I'm grateful for that rant. What was behind the question was thinking about whether or not that kind of way of reading the world is itself a form of elite capture, this sort of divvying up the world into people we can listen to and not listen to for various kinds of reasons that really don't rely on the merits of their thought. And that being something that happens, unfortunately in activist, leftist, radical circles quite a bit. And so, I don't know. I think I was curious about what you might make of that, because I think for a lot of people there would be this question: why Fraser? Why Woodson? Maybe not why Woodson, but certainly maybe why Fraser. And so, yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but it's okay if not. There's a bunch of cool places we can go.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I could also rant about this too, but smaller version of a rant. One of the things I'm trying to resist, by way of making the other point, right, that you can learn from the insights of people whether or not they share your politics, is also that, like, the point of learning from people is to learn from them, right? So by citing Fraser, I'm not trying to say this is a Fraserian account of the world, right? Again, any more than I would be committing myself to that because I've cited David Lewis, or if I had cited Hegel, or etc. And there's this kind of aestheticization of authors, particularly Black authors who are in any way radical, particularly, other authors of color. There's a way of kind of wielding their names or, their identity markers in a pitch to kind of, aesthetically cast your politics as a certain kind, irrespective of the actual things that they said. And, there's a kind of inattention to the actual things that they said that comes from that aestheticization. And, both the inattention and the aestheticization itself are things that I'm trying to resist.
Yeah, I feel like you got another banger essay in there about the aestheticization of Black radical authors. I feel like you need to maybe get on that. Um, But very quickly, I think we're about to dive into the book proper. But I'm curious about something you said earlier. I'm still with this question about sort of elite capture, sort of taking off in a certain set of conditions, right? It being more sort of palatable in certain conditions. And I wanted to ask a question about sort of you begin your book in the I think you don't begin in the United States, but you begin the book thinking about identity politics, and I think some of the problems that I think are most visible in sort of U.S. politics. And so I'm curious about that in relationship to you sort of invoking sort of the best examples of strategies to resist elite capture outside of the US. And I wonder if that's intentional, or I wonder how we think about that, right? Like, are those strategies sort of portable in the ways that we would want? You know what I mean, given the nature of the US and how it operates, or are they strategies that can only, for whatever reason, happen outside of the bounds of a nation like the US?
Yeah, I'm one of the things. I mean, book tries to be international in focus, and if nothing else, I hope it accomplishes getting people to see, encouraging people to see the US's political conditions as specific, right? So, it's not as though the rest of the world is a kind of asterisk where there's stuff that works in the not U.S. and there's stuff that works in the U.S. and we never the twain shall meet or something like that. I know you don't think that, and most people don't. I don't think would accept a claim that was phrased so bald-facedly. But nevertheless, we kind of relegate politics elsewhere to sidelines sometimes, and give the particular features of particular eras of U.S. politics more universal features than they deserve. Like, this is a place. And I don't so much think that reflecting on the liberation struggle in Guinea-Bissau is a direct answer to how to win liberation in the U.S., so much as I think reflecting on the differences between the U.S. and Guinea-Bissau might be helpful for understanding why the U.S. might require different strategies and, particular approaches and particular ways of thinking.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I was curious about. I mean, that was the basic question. Like, how do these two places and their specific uh, political structures, how do we understand then what happens on the ground and compare them to each other? I think that was in the question, but also trying to think about whether or not the inequality in the U.S. and the way that that inequality is structured, it does differ from other countries, and whether or not that makes it more difficult to stage certain kinds of interventions. But I think we'll probably get into that as we move maybe across the book. Um, so one of the things I was interested in, and I know I'm sure you have an answer to this, is how is elite capture different than the Pareto principle or the 80-20 principle? And I'm curious about whether or not it has a unique explanatory power or a unique political valence. I'm just curious what you would say to someone who's just like, oh, well, basically what you're describing is this economic principle that, folks have talked about for years.
Yeah, so it's definitely a similar kind of thought as the Pareto principle. And, Pareto was one of the kind of OG researchers of elite politics, right? So that's actually a reassuring result for me if it turns out to be something similar to that. All that said, what I'm trying to say is extremely holistic. So you might start with how wealth is divided, but where one should end up is how social life is organized quite broadly. So, find me a resource, whether it's monetary resources, wealth, dollars, or whether it's more intangible kinds of resources, attention, whether it's something in the middle, research capacity, state capacity. And you're going to find relationships between how the aspects of human life and activity that explain how those resources get produced and where those resources go, they wrap themselves tightly around hierarchies. I don't think it's a law of human organization as such. We could create a world where being an elite meant something quite different from what it has meant so far under capitalism. But we would have to create the world. We would have to do that on purpose. And so it's a contingent result of the particular ways that we've designed human interaction.
Yeah, the reason why I ask is because, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, but like the 80-20 principle like obtains across, like sports endeavors, for example, right? Like if you look at the NBA, 20% of the players are, doing 80% of putting all the stats on the board and something like that. I mean, it obtains in so many different parts of society. And so it's interesting to hear you say it's not a law of human organizations as such, because I still wonder what you do, and I don't know if you've engaged this literature, what you do with some of the various findings where the Pareto principle has seemed to be in effect, even in places that you could say aren't sort of aren't entirely determined by capitalist relation. And I'd have to think about where that is, but I'm sure I could come up with an example.
Yeah, I mean, what the Pareto principle is at bottom is it's an observation about causal structure, right? Not all of the things that produce outcomes are equally relevant to explaining, total system level outcomes. So that's a thing that could apply to basketball just as it could apply to, GDP. But what we're interested in as people, on Team Justice, let's say, isn't actually, explaining outcomes in this kind of passive way, but explaining outcomes in this more clearly socially contrived, socially constructed way. So take basketball, for instance. It is true, let's say, that 20% of the players generate 80% of the points or something like that, right? So, LeBron and the sixth man are not going to put up the same numbers, right? But if the team wins the championship, everybody gets a ring, right? That's the social outcome of how we've decided to split up the kind of result of a process that people contribute to, in this imbalanced way, right? LeBron gets a ring, the towel manager gets a ring, maybe the towel manager doesn't get a ring, but everybody on the team gets a ring. And it's that outcome space, it's the kind of response to the, whatever inequalities are natural, let's say, that's the place where social outcomes live. So it's because we've decided that basketball is a team sport that it's the team that gets a ring or doesn't, and not the individual scorers that get rings and don't. There are plenty of other things in the NBA that are unequally distributed, like pay, right? But those too are outcomes of how we've decided to organize teams, organize compensation, right? We let people negotiate individually for what team they're going to be on in the first place and how much they're going to get paid, and those explain, the inequalities in the system in the same way that the basics of the game explains the equality in championship rings. And if we want to win justice, we're going to have to figure out another way to relate to whatever inequalities might be naturally, what might exist naturally. One potential principle might be from each according to their ability and to each according to their need. And then you might well have the Pareto principle on the way in, the from each according to their ability, but nevertheless have something egalitarian on the way out, to each according to their need.
Yeah. No, that's a really great way, an elegant way of answering that. So thank you for engaging with that so deeply. Um, So I'm curious about whether or not, elite capture, and you described this in your book, but I wonder if you could say some words about it, about whether or not it sort of takes different forms and different sort of social organizations at different levels of society, about historically, if we're looking, across maybe a century, whether it looks different across that century. I wonder if you could just sort of talk about the sort of nature and character of it in time or across time.
Yeah, I think elite capture is as variable as our political structures are. And you might even think of our political structures as being, or at least implying, different forms and kinds of elite capture. That might be one way to sit them next to each other, right? Capitalism is a particular kind of economic system where a particular kind of elite has captured the means of production, right? Like, it's an economic system where we define a new sort of elite around the means of production. We could define economic elites differently, as was true under feudalism. And that's one way of explaining what the difference is between the two systems. Similarly, I think at different scales across different eras, we're going to find different kinds of elite capture and different extents of elite capture. In a populist political era, or in a state socialist government, right? The elites and non-elites might be very close in wealth and political power, or at least closer than in other systems, in an autocracy, say, right? And I think really what we're likelier to get comparing across eras isn't, times when there is elite capture versus times when there isn't. We should think of inequality. We should think of elite capture in the way that we think of inequality, right? Where it can be greater or lesser. In fact, inequality itself is one of the two things that two families of things about a society that I think is probably most predictive of the level of elite capture, right? Do the elites have 1,000 times the amount of wealth as the non-elites? Do they have 100 times? Do they have 10 times? Those three scenarios are going to be very different elite capture scenarios, all other things being equal. But it's not just the level of difference between the economic or otherwise political power of the elites versus non-elites that explains how elite capture functions and how much of it you have. I think the other thing are institutions, in particular the institutions that are designed to constrain elite capture. So, holding everything else constant, do you have a strong labor movement? Do you have strong unions, or do you have weak unions? Right? Strong unions, even in the presence of high wealth inequality, are probably going to constrain elite capture. weak unions in the face of high income and wealth inequality are probably not going to be able to constrain elite capture. And the other scenarios are somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And you're venturing into an area that I want to talk about, which is sort of thinking about elite capture and its consequences for how sort of all kinds of people, even non-elites, relate to one another. And so I was really struck by your use of "The Emperor Has No Clothes," that fairy tale. And I wonder if you could say a bit about the role it plays in helping you explain how how authority structures social life.
I've been gravitating towards that example for years now, a better part of a decade. And what I like about it is that a lot of people know it, right? So that makes it helpful for communicating, right? But the other thing that I like about it, beyond that, just the convenience, is that it's actually different, meaningfully different from a lot of the ways that I think we're habituated into talking about inequality and oppression. And so it serves as a reminder that, hey, there's this simple idea that we all understand that we all could just get more use out of than we currently do, right? We could just use it more widely than we necessarily do right now. And that is, of course, the idea that people have reasons to say things and to act in particular ways other than really wanting to do those things. Right? The Emperor Has No Clothes story, just a quick summation of it for anybody listening who might not be familiar with the story. The Emperor's advisors come in with a hanger that has nothing on it, an empty hanger, and they tell the Emperor that it's a fancy robe that can only be seen by the competent and smart and great. And so the Emperor pretends to put it on. He walks around the town. Everybody pretends to see it until a small child makes fun of the naked Emperor, and then everybody laughs, right? That's the story. And what the story is cluing us into is the ordinary, mundane relationship of power dynamics between people and power structures, which explain those dynamics in explaining people's behavior. When the Emperor passes by I say the candlestick maker in the book, just somebody on the street, we don't have to think that they are fooled by the advisor's story. Right? We can just think maybe the Emperor's kind of an asshole and could do whatever he wants to me if I embarrass him, and maybe would do whatever he wants to me if I embarrass him. That's already good enough to explain why people act as if the Emperor's really wearing clothes. And what that is saying is that the problem in those communicative interactions, the problem happening when somebody pretends to see the robe and compliments the Emperor on the robe, isn't a problem of ideology. It's not a problem of beliefs necessarily, right? It's not a problem necessarily of people having distorted pictures of what the world is actually like. We don't have to think that anybody really believes the Emperor is wearing clothes. Not the advisors, not the Emperor, not the people. It could be that every single individual in the story knows that the Emperor has no clothes on, but everybody's trying to figure out what reactions from other people, work out to their advantage in the best kind of way. And I think incentives, power structures are that fundamental to how we act in the world. And if we were willing to make more use of that idea, we might be, more willing and up for reforming our power structures directly than necessarily trying to convince everybody all the time, that this thing is true or that thing is true.
Yeah, no, I mean, I love that. It's like one of my favorite parts of the book, right? That everything isn't sort of reducible down to ideology or sort of false ideology or something like that. I mean, I think it's really powerfully explanatory. Um, I think I have a question here, and I don't know, I'm tripping over formulating it, but I guess I'm curious about, okay, so you have all of these sort of incentives, these power structures on one hand, and then you have the emperor sort of naked before us. And I guess, like, I mean, a part of your book is about the difficulty of then convincing people that it's worth talking about the emperor who's naked before us. But could you maybe, I don't know, tell us why that's so difficult? And I know I'm skipping ahead here, but it seems to me like that's a really tough thing, right? You've just sort of laid out. Maybe we all know it, right? But for various reasons, we don't want to die. We have children. We need our livelihood. We're already on the emperor's bad side for whatever reason. There are real reasons to stay mum. And so even people who are engaged in maybe various kinds of revolutionary work, various kinds of radical work, I mean, you in your book sort of point out that they're like sort of no less likely to maybe have forms of elite capture within their organizations. And so I guess I'm curious about that, about what produces that difficulty of having that honest conversation. He's parading through town naked, and it takes the courage of a child or even the ignorance of a child to not know the stakes of its speech, of his, her, their speech, to point out what's before everyone.
Yeah, the way that I like to think about it is less in terms of convincing people that the emperor is naked, and more in terms of how do we make it easy to point out that the emperor is naked. And to kind of map this back onto the stakes that we're interested in, that I think you're honing in on in the question. One of the most powerful reasons that people act as though the empire that we live in has clothes is that people don't really have a reason not to, right? People have a lot to lose if they do. They have little to lose if they go along with the story we're all telling. Colin Kaepernick lost a very lucrative job for the mildest of symbolic recognitions that the empire might not have clothes on. And, all the people who did stand for the Pledge of Allegiance were fine. That's the kind of thing that explains, quite a bit of elite capture. I don't know what anybody in the NFL stadium, standing for the Star Spangled Banner really thinks about the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. But if I had to guess, I would guess that they mostly don't. No, that is the secret of privilege and power. Like we spend so much time trying to figure out the different stereotypes and ways that power structures and powerful people and powerful organizations distort what it is to be this oppressed group or that oppressed group, and the ways that they think wrongly or inaccurately or unfairly about oppressed groups, but they mostly do not. They think about, what they're trying to do and moves they're trying to make. And, when they involve us at all, it's usually as things to be stepped on the way to where they're going. And yeah, no, I guess that's the other thing about, I think that puts us back in the territory of the constructive approach of building power, building organizations. At the end of the day, HR can throw you all the pizza parties they want, but until the work conditions mean something to the corporation on the terms that they understand as being meaningful, I suspect their attention will be elsewhere. And, strikes speak to capital in the language that capital understands.
Yeah. I guess behind that question, and I'm sure we'll talk about it a bit more, is, I mean, you said most people don't have any reason sort of not to go along with what it means to get along. I guess I'm curious about how we get people over that hump, since it seems like we're in a moment where we're seeing, sort of even radical energies be subsumed back into just a sort of another part of the apparatus. So even the example you gave of Colin Kaepernick, I mean, he's had a very interesting afterlife following that protest, and it becomes hard to think about, well, damn, like, what, gosh, it becomes really hard. But I don't want us to get bogged down here because there's so much more to talk about in your book. And so maybe we can turn to Carter G. Woodson. I think he might be sort of useful to get us moving on some of your other ideas. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about why he's so central to your thinking. And I'm thinking especially about your invocation of Woodson in relationship to the concept of common ground that you bring up in your book.
Yeah, so I think this calls back something that we were talking about earlier in terms of what kinds of contributions thinkers can make. So the kind of contribution that Carter G. Woodson made, to my mind, was to just make it plain, from a theoretical standpoint, the kind of intervention that the Emperor's New Clothes story makes. The Emperor's New Clothes story makes it via, allegory. It tells you this little fable. Carter G. Woodson is making this same kind of intervention concretely talking about an actual social system, which is, the system of education that he encountered in the U.S. and its colonies. There's so much to say about education. For now, for now, what I'll say is, I think what Carter G. Woodson found is that, you just don't need the distinction, right? A system of education just is another one of the systems that are designed in conformity with colonial interests, right? So once you figured out how colonialism works, how colonial interests protect themselves, then you figured out how they do education, right? It's not as though, there's a nefarious plot to convince Black students that they aren't worth as much as other students. That is certainly the thing that the colonial interests think, and that is how they run the education system. But it's how they run the education system because it's how they run the colony, right? So you're talking about a subsystem of the larger system, but that education system is just part and parcel of the overall power structure. And once you understand that, you'll understand the classroom, right? In the same way that once you understand the empire, you will understand why the candlestick maker compliments the emperor on his clothes, even though he isn't wearing any.
Well, yeah. Well, you almost went there. I feel like you're anticipating my question, and so we might as well go there now. Why are educators? I mean, I feel like you've already answered this, but just in case you want to say more, educators have real pride of place in your book, and I was so curious about that and struck by sort of just the multiple examples of folks who were teachers, right? And not even, they might have been professors also, but they really understood themselves as sort of being in the room teachers, being on the ground teachers, as sort of that being an important part of their sort of activist praxis. And so I wonder if you could talk about that in relationship to elite capture and the things that you're interested in?
Yeah, I don't know. I've gone back and forth on this a lot. Why did I gravitate so much to teachers? And I feel like, in the spirit of keeping with my own materialist analysis, right? I should be honest enough to say one potential reason is just that I am a teacher, and maybe I just have a hammer and so I see nails everywhere, right? Maybe that's what's going on. But maybe there's something more to it, and the something more to it that might be there is that I think what education is doing, and education in the kind of broad sense that Carter G. Woodson was thinking, and not just education in the narrow sense of what goes on between 7 and 3 at a K through 12 school or something like that, right? But what we're doing when we build the next generation of people, which is what we're doing when we educate, is laying the political conditions to either continue or to redirect the progress of our society up until now. Like, education is just an aspect of society where we are directly engaged in the project of what tomorrow is going to be at, at a holistic sense, and hopefully building relationships between people accordingly. And I think a lot of the revolutionaries that I studied, Lilika Boal, Amilcar Cabral, I think they understood what they were doing in those same terms. That's why they saw education and combat as both top priorities, right? During a war, if you want to have a self-determining population, you need to build the kinds of relationships, the kinds of resources, and the kinds of people that can actually do that. It's not a thing you write down in a book somewhere. It's a thing that you build.
Yeah, no, that's great. Like, I'm really gonna put that on my dry erase board tomorrow in my office. Education is engaged in the project of what tomorrow will be. I mean, I love thinking about it as a kind of constructive project. And if we have time, I would love to hear from you about what that might look like. Geez, right now in our everyday jobs, but just because that's a big question. Um, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about deference, politics, and standpoint epistemology. As I said, that was the first kind of essay. I don't remember the original title that I came to of yours, and so I wonder if you could tell us about how it relates to folks who you describe as sort of already being in the room, and that being the part of identity politics that you sort of were most unsettled by, we'll say.
Yeah. So the essay was called Being in the Room Privilege. And one of the things I was reacting to and trying to think my way through is the gap between theory, as I understood it, and practice in identity politics around, these core ideas of standpoint epistemology. So there are independent moral reasons to think this, but people also say that they have kind of knowledge reasons to say things like what we should do is center the most marginalized, and those kinds of phrases that for me cue up deference politics or deference epistemology. And what people are saying are indeed the core insights of standpoint epistemology, which I'm just on the team for. Standpoint epistemology is what's up, right? Knowledge is socially situated. What you know depends on where you are in society and what you can know and what's easy for you to know. Marginalized people have, special, direct, easier access to certain kinds of information. We should take that into account when we do research. Those are core tenets of standpoint epistemology. Each one of them is just correct as far as I can tell, and important, crucially important. But one of the things that I was reacting to is, my point of view, Black left politics is fairly well represented, not as well as I would like, obviously, but, there's lots of Black lefty folks in the grad school that I went to and in academy as I encountered it. And people often talked about those perspectives, and just talked about them as the Black perspective. And I found that a little confusing, because I was like, if y'all's churches were anything like mine, that we are a fringe perspective, just numerically, just count. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of people who people's politics are complicated and they're varied, right? Like people who might be progressive on, imperialism, might be less progressive on sexuality, but might be progressive with respect to workers' rights, et cetera, right? Like people contain multitudes. We all contain multitudes. All that is good. But in terms of, what we're doing in Black radical politics, the starting point for me has been that, we are a minority, not just in the sense of having access to these institutions, but in having these politics. And pursuing those politics without admitting this doesn't make sense to me. And thus, the idea that centering the most marginalized is going to involve lifting up your perspective, which is not the statistically most common one, also didn't make sense to me. This is a thing that I say openly now because I feel like I've sorted out how I want to say it, but I didn't say it in this way in the essay. Partially because what I was trying to figure out is what's going on? What's the motivation for talking in this way? And what's the fairest I can be to it?
So can I ask you so do you read that as a kind of elite capture? And I get that we can imagine a bunch of different actors who have different motivations, like the Black leftist who does want greater clout within the institution. And let's be real, that is a way of getting it in this current moment. And so I'm curious about that. Do you understand that as a form of elite capture? And if you do, to me, this is where it gets kind of tricky, because it's like, yes, we all know that person who's a Black leftist who nevertheless is only thinking about how to get more money out of the university for themselves, how to get that endowed chair, whatever. And I guess I'm curious about how we understand that, because they might even still be a true believer. You know what I mean? And so it's so entangled, that I wonder what we do with that person, right? Who's willing to speak on behalf of Black people who don't want what they're talking about, while they're also sort of using that language not really to fight any freedom struggle, but to elevate themselves with a certain kind of cachet within an institution that we know for the most part is harmful to the populations this person, sort of espouses, sort of pretends to be act on whose behalf they pretend to be acting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I'm just curious how you understand that.
Yeah, this is part of why it was so important for me to think of elite capture as a system behavior.
I got you. Yep.
Right.
Okay.
So, right. So because all those stories, there are versions of all those stories, right? There's the person who sits here and calculates and be like, what do I say about Black people to get the grant or whatever, right? And then there's right. We're gonna get in trouble. All right.
Yeah.
So there's that person. There's the person who has just drunk the Kool-Aid, right? There's the person who just, genuinely believes that what I'm saying is either the opinion of Black people or the opinion of the Black people who matter. And there's lots to unpack there, but I'll move on for just a second. There's the person that's just kind of, curious and trusting, right? Who, isn't at the top of the academic hierarchies and sees what the people who are at the top of the academic hierarchies are saying, and tries to get in where they fit in, right? All of that is happening. There's no unifying psychological story to tell across those actors. The only thing to tell, or the only unifying story, is the basic kind of material gap between which people can access, the levers of, the imprimatur of fancy school and the advertising dollars of a well-resourced press, and et cetera, et cetera. There's those who can access those and those who can't. And the selection of those who can is not random, right? It's related to all these, selection biases. It's related to who could go to the good schools earlier and all those other things. And so that's the thing I was trying to work through in the being in the room privilege essay. And that ended up being a really central kind of thought to the whole project.
No, that's really great. And we're running out of time, but I still wanted to get there. I have two more questions, things that I just absolutely want to talk to you about before we go. And so you've talked about this a bit throughout our conversation, but I wonder if you could just go ahead and spell out for us your idea of constructive politics as being a way to combat elite capture, to combat some of these bad forms of identity politics, et cetera.
Yeah, so the thing that I'm contrasting constructive politics to is what I call deference politics. So, one thing you could do once you recognize the being in the room privilege problem, you could think, well, the university has already admitted whoever it's admitted, the business has already hired whoever it's hired to this or that level of decision making. And the only thing I can do from here is, manage my interactions differently. I can listen to the Black person in the room or to the trans person in the room, or, whatever the relevant identity might be. Right. And I could redistribute power in the room as it's been built for me by the powers that be. And that's what I can do to challenge injustice. And, acts of deference, sometimes that's the person to listen to in the room. I'm not at all disputing that. I just don't think it's a good overall orientation to the whole social problem that we have. And so constructive politics is what I'm trying to push for instead, as an alternative kind of area of focus to the deference approach. So constructive politics is we need to build things. We need to build organizations. We need to build things like unions or, movements, things that are repeated patterns of interaction that can change the actual society that explains who gets what and what forms of justice or injustice prevail. And so, from that kind of starting point, you end up being in a different kind of, you end up thinking of the problem and the solution a bit differently, right? Whatever we want to say about people in the elite making mistakes, either moral mistakes or kind of, social scientific mistakes, just getting wrong what the world is like, none of that is new, right? None of that is particular to our generation. Every generation is going to produce opportunists and grifters and et cetera, and just negligent people and careful people. Like, if there's a bunch of people, there's a bunch of variation. That's just how we work as creatures. But the question is, how much can those people get away with. And that's a question about, the forms of organization that there are, the forms of social constraint, the forms of norms, the forms of, actual sanction that people meet out in the world. And those are things that we build, right? If somebody from the PAIGC wanted to make a statement to press about, what Guinea-Bissau really wanted, right, there would have been, ways of holding that person accountable, right? If they said something that wasn't what the total group wanted. In the absence of that kind of organization, then, individuals are going to vary in the way that individuals always vary. So, yeah, I think it's a call for building organization, for building the good kinds of political culture, and for doing those in ways that are hopefully mutually supporting.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, the last thing I wanted to talk to you about was just like the sort of last chapter in your book, and I was really struck by it seems like to me a tonal shift, and you start talking about sort of trauma and its place in remaking the world. And I wonder if you could say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're definitely right to see it as a tonal shift. And what I wanted to do, I wanted to focus the book on the kind of merits of the positions that I'm taking up and taking issue with. But I think one of the things we end up having to acknowledge, especially if we have this practical focus, right, is that we're not that rational. We do things for all sorts of reasons. Some of them have to do with our kind of considered judgments of the world, but some of those things have to do with our experiences, our feelings, our resentments, our hopes, our aspirations, who we respect, who we resent. And the role of trauma and the way that we think about trauma in the kind of intellectual positions that the rest of the book responds to is something that I touched on in the Being in the Room essay, which is the kind of backbone for that chapter. And it's something that I think you have to take head on. And I really, if I convince people of nothing else in the book, I want to convince people of that chapter, of that way of getting off with deference politics, because it's not just that, as an intellectual matter, that, marginalization doesn't give you all of the answers, but even in a deeper, effective, moral, spiritual sense, trauma doesn't give you all the answers. It just doesn't. That's not what it is. It's not what it's for.
Yeah, I saw you quote Sarah Schulman, and you're fighting the good fight, but she's received a lot of hell for that book. And so I saw that, and I was like, okay, Femi. Okay, you're fighting the good fight out here.
We'll see how it goes,
Well, thank you so much for being in conversation with me.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. It's a great conversation.